A single mother was dragged out of her apartment in front of her young daughter, her crime. Speaking out against the landlord's injustice, with no one to turn to, she stood in the cold, humiliated and heartbroken. But what if the next person who walked by wasn't just another stranger? What if he could offer her the help she needed the most without expecting anything in return? Who was this millionaire? And why did he step in when everyone else turned away? If this story tugs at your heart like it did mine, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps us keep bringing you these powerful moments. Leave a comment to share how this story made you feel. Lily sat on the sidewalk, clutching Sophie in her arms, her eyes lost in the sea of passing cars. The heat of the Texas sun burned down on them, making the air shimmer in the distance. Sophie, feverish and pale, nestled against her mother's chest, her tiny face twisted in discomfort. The scene around them was loud, bustling with cars and people moving about, but none of them seemed to notice the woman and child stranded in the middle of it all. It had been hours since they were tossed out of the house that was once meant to be a home, the house where she had raised Sophie, the house where the memories of a marriage that was supposed to last forever were now tainted with anger and abandonment. Her ex-husband's family had done it. His parents, with their cold eyes and harsh words, had made it clear that Lily, a woman without a job and with a sick child, was no longer welcome. Lily's heart ached as she looked down at her daughter. She was all Sophie had, and Sophie was all she had left. But in this moment, she felt utterly alone, abandoned by the world around her. There was no one to turn to, no place to go. Not even her pride could keep her from feeling small and insignificant. She wasn't even sure where to go next. She was lost. But more importantly, Sophie was suffering, and Lily felt helpless. A car passed by, then another, and another. The sun kept climbing, and Lily's hope seemed to drain with the sweat that beaded on her forehead. She heard the sound of a car pulling up next to her. Her eyes didn't move. She was too tired to look. But then, the sound of a door opening caught her attention. She looked up, but didn't see the person at first. He was tall, wearing a faded leather jacket, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. The man stepped closer, his boots clicking softly against the pavement. David Henderson, or so the name on the car's license plate suggested. He wasn't exactly the kind of person Lily was used to seeing. He was an outlier, a person whose world was far removed from hers. But his gaze wasn't distant. It was intent, sharp, as if he had already made his mind up about something. He knelt down, gently brushing a strand of hair away from Sophie's flushed face. Lily instinctively pulled Sophie closer, unsure of this stranger's intentions. But he smiled, and in that brief moment, something about him felt different. His eyes, deep, sincere, held hers for a long second before he spoke. "You and your daughter won't have to suffer anymore," he said, his voice calm, yet it carried a weight that made Lily's heart skip a beat. There was something about his words that caught her off guard. It wasn't just an offer of help. It was a promise. Her mind raced. A million thoughts flooded her consciousness, but none of them made sense. Why was this man, this stranger, stopping? Why was he helping? No one else had cared. No one had even looked in her direction. Yet here he was, offering something she couldn't even begin to understand. Lily's hand trembled as she looked at him, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Was this real? Was this just a trick? She couldn't trust him. She couldn't trust anyone anymore. But Sophie was so sick, and she had no choice but to take a chance. Her instincts told her to say no, to refuse, to walk away. But the desperation for her daughter's health and well-being crushed her hesitation. David reached out his hand, palm open, as though inviting her to take it. Lily glanced at it, then back at Sophie's pale face. She took a deep breath, weighing the risk, but it felt like no decision at all. Her hands moved on their own, and she placed her hand into his. The touch was warm, but it held something else, certainty. He was offering more than just his help. He was offering a way out of this nightmare, but Lily couldn't ignore the nagging voice in her head. What did he want in return? What strings were attached? David didn't let go of her hand. Instead, he pulled her gently to her feet, standing tall beside her. His gaze softened, and his lips curled into a slight smile. Let's get Sophie the help she needs. Lily stood frozen for a moment, not knowing what to do, or even if she should trust him. She looked at him again, searching his eyes for any sign of deceit. But there was nothing there, only a quiet resolve. A car passed by in the distance, the world moving on as it always did. Lily glanced one last time at the bustling street, at the indifferent people. She thought about the rejection, the judgment, and the life that had been torn apart. And in that moment, something inside her cracked open. She didn't know what was coming next, or if this man would truly help. She didn't know if it was a lie, or a truth wrapped in mystery. But for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this could be the beginning of something better. David's voice broke the silence. I'm not asking for anything in return. I just want to help. His words were simple, but they held something unspoken, an assurance that, for once, someone was offering help without asking for anything in return. Lily didn't look back, but as they drove away, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, deep inside her. For better or worse, she had taken a chance. Lily sat at the small kitchen table in the guest house of David Henderson's estate, staring down at the untouched cup of coffee in front of her. Sophie was asleep in the room next door, and the silence in the house was almost oppressive. It was hard to believe that, just a day ago, she had been sitting on the sidewalk in the blistering heat, with no one stopping to help. And now, here she was, living in a lavish home with no real understanding of how she had gotten here. She hadn't asked for David's help. In fact, she hadn't wanted it. But it was difficult to ignore the relief she felt seeing Sophie resting peacefully, free from the unbearable fever that had gripped her just hours earlier. The doctor he had arranged for Sophie's care had assured her that the worst was over. The relief was overwhelming, but mixed with it was a heavy sense of guilt. She didn't know this man. He was a stranger. And yet, he had opened his door to them. But then, there was the nagging feeling in her chest, something she couldn't shake. Why was he doing this? Why help her? A woman with no connections, no money, and no way of paying him back. Lily had always been self-sufficient. She had never asked anyone for help. But now, she was indebted to this man who seemed to have everything. She tried not to think about it, but she couldn't. He had been kind, but kindness from someone like him felt foreign, like an act, something calculated. A man who had everything, who could buy and sell anyone, didn't give his time and resources away without a reason. And that's what kept her awake at night. David had left her to herself, saying she could take her time to adjust. He didn't ask many questions about her past, nor did he seem curious. It made her feel like a guest in his home, but not a part of his world. His silence about her life, about Sophie's condition, felt almost like a form of detachment. He was giving her shelter, but not once did he push to understand her, or why she had ended up on the streets. The lack of interest should have been comforting, but it only made her more suspicious. Meanwhile, David had returned to his own life. He didn't mention their brief encounter after the offer of help, and he certainly didn't press her for anything in return. She couldn't help but wonder if it was just a ploy, a way to gain leverage or control over her in some way. Maybe he felt guilty about something. Maybe she wasn't the first person he had helped. Later that afternoon, Lily found herself sitting in the garden, trying to calm her thoughts. The sprawling estate stretched out before her, and everything seemed perfect, too perfect. The manicured lawns, the expensive cars parked in the driveway, everything screamed wealth. It was all so different from the worn-out apartment and cramped spaces she had left behind in Austin. She thought about her old life, how far she had fallen since then. It had been so easy to believe that she had control, that things would work out for her and Sophie. But here she was, taken in by a man whose world was so far removed from her own. And yet, she felt this invisible pull to him. The door to the guest house creaked open, and she looked up to see David standing in the doorway, looking at her with a soft expression. He didn't say anything at first, just watched her for a moment. Lily forced a smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "I hope you're comfortable here," he said, his voice steady but still carrying a touch of something that made her uneasy. "If there's anything you need, just let me know." She nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something, that there was more to this than just kindness. But for now, she couldn't afford to push it. Sophie needed her, and she couldn't afford to get distracted by doubts. David turned to leave, but before he stepped out, he glanced back at her. "You don't have to explain yourself. I'm not asking you to share your past. Just get better. That's all that matters now." His words felt hollow. He seemed to be giving her the space she needed, but there was something about the way he said it that made her feel like she was being studied. His eyes were too calm, too composed. As David disappeared into the house, Lily stood up and walked back inside. Her phone buzzed on the table, and she glanced at the screen. It was a message. The sender was unknown, and the message itself made her freeze. "I know about your past. David Henderson is not who you think he is." Her fingers shook as she read the message again, trying to process the meaning. Who could know about her past? She hadn't told anyone, not even David. It wasn't possible. But the message was there, and it felt too real to ignore. Lily's heart raced. She had thought she was safe here, but now there was doubt. Who was this person, and why would they reach out to her now? She couldn't trust David. Not yet. She had to know more. But just as quickly as the message had appeared, it vanished into the void of her phone, leaving her with nothing but questions. The knot in her stomach tightened, and she stared at the empty screen, wondering just how deep this web of secrecy went. David Henderson wasn't the man he claimed to be. But what did that mean for her? And Sophie Lily stepped out of the car, feeling the cool evening air brush against her skin. Sophie was still asleep in the back seat, tucked in a warm blanket, blissfully unaware of the storm of emotions swirling around her mother. She glanced over at David, who stood tall and confident, his presence as imposing as the grand mansion looming behind him. David had invited her and Sophie to attend a gala hosted by his company, Henderson Holdings. It was an event she had never imagined herself attending. The venue was a massive ballroom in a high-rise building downtown, glittering with lights and filled with elegantly dressed people. As they walked through the doors, Lily felt the stark contrast between the world she knew and the one she was now stepping into. The guests in the room were a mixture of business magnates, socialites, and politicians, all with their heads held high and their conversations in full swing. It was clear that this was a world Lily had never been a part of. Her simple dress felt out of place among the designer gowns and sharp tuxedos. She tried to steady her breath, but her heart raced with each step. She felt the eyes of the room glance at her, some curious, some dismissive. She was the outsider here, and she knew it. David, however, walked confidently through the crowd, nodding and exchanging pleasantries with his colleagues. He didn't seem to notice the stares or the whispers that followed them. For a moment, Lily felt the dissonance between them more than ever. David belonged here, in this world of power and wealth. She didn't. As they made their way to a quieter corner, David glanced over at her, a soft smile playing on his lips. "We don't have to stay long," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I just thought you should experience this. You deserve to be in this world too." Lily looked at him, unsure of how to respond. She appreciated the gesture, but something about his words didn't sit right with her. It felt almost too rehearsed, like he was trying to make her feel comfortable in a place where she would never belong. She nodded, unsure of how to explain the discomfort gnawing at her. David led her to a small table at the edge of the room, where they sat, his hand resting lightly on the back of her chair. His presence was comforting, yet his world was so different from hers. It was like being on the edge of a dream she didn't belong to, one that seemed too bright and too perfect for someone like her. A waiter came by, offering drinks, and David ordered a glass of wine for Lily. She hesitated for a moment before accepting, not wanting to seem rude. The wine tasted sharp, too sophisticated for her simple tastes. It was like everything here, she realized, polished, expensive, and out of reach. But she was here, for Sophie, for the hope that David had offered her. She had to keep reminding herself of that. "Thank you for this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "for helping us." David turned his head to look at her, his expression softening. "You don't have to thank me, Lily," he said quietly. "I want to help you. You deserve more than what you've had." His words echoed in her mind. You deserve more. She had heard those words before, spoken by others who didn't really understand what it meant to be her, to be someone who had fought for everything she had, who had faced rejection, who had lost everything. She couldn't just accept that a man like David Henderson could offer her everything without any strings attached. There had to be a catch, a reason he was doing this. She didn't know what it was, but it lingered in the back of her mind, like a question that refused to be answered. As they sat there, Lily tried to focus on the conversation around her. She listened to people talk about business deals, philanthropic efforts, and the latest social events. But none of it felt real to her. She wasn't a part of this world, and no matter how hard she tried to pretend, she couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong here. Suddenly, a voice interrupted her thoughts. A woman had approached their table, her sharp heels clicking on the marble floor. She was impeccably dressed, her gaze calculating as she looked between Lily and David. "David, I didn't expect to see you with her," the woman said, her tone laced with curiosity and a hint of disdain. "I didn't know you were one for charity work." Lily felt her stomach twist. The woman's words felt like a slap in the face, and the sudden shift in the atmosphere was enough to make her feel small and out of place. She didn't belong here, and neither did Sophie. The woman's eyes raked over her, judging her in a way that only the wealthy could. David's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "This is Lily," he said, his voice calm but firm. "She's not here for charity. She's here as my guest. Please don't assume anything." The woman raised an eyebrow but didn't argue further. She nodded and walked away, leaving an air of discomfort lingering in her wake. Lily sat there, her face flushed with embarrassment. David's hand rested briefly on her arm, his touch reassuring, but it didn't erase the sting of the woman's words. She could feel the judgment hanging in the air, like an invisible barrier between her and the world she was now in. She tried to compose herself, but the unease kept creeping back. "Are you all right?" David asked, his voice gentle. Lily nodded, but the feeling of being judged, of being an outsider, weighed heavily on her. It was like everything about her was on display, dissected, judged. She wasn't just a guest in this world, she was a curiosity. Before she could respond, another voice interrupted, this time a man's. He stepped up to their table, his eyes trained on Lily. "You're David's guest, aren't you?" he asked, his gaze lingering on her a little too long. Lily nodded again, her mouth dry. She wasn't sure what she was supposed to say. The eyes on her were too much, and the questions they posed were unspoken but loud. "You must be new to all this," the man continued, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "David Henderson doesn't usually mix with people like you." Lily's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" she asked, unable to keep the sharpness from her voice. The man leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "David's a businessman. He doesn't do charity. So, if you're here for some kind of handout, you might want to reconsider." Lily's mind raced. She had felt like an outsider from the beginning, but this was different. This wasn't just a feeling. It was a reality that she had been too afraid to face until now. Her gaze shifted to David, who sat motionless, his eyes locked on the man. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, a mix of irritation and resignation. The man didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked away, leaving Lily and David in a silence that felt heavier than the weight of the entire room. David didn't speak for a long moment, and Lily found herself staring at the glass in her hand, the wine now a dull color in the dim lighting. Finally, David cleared his throat. "Don't listen to him, Lily," he said, his voice steady. "I know what you're thinking, but it's not true." Lily didn't say anything. She couldn't. The words stuck in her throat, thick with doubt. But before she could respond, someone else approached the table. A man this time, tall and well-dressed, his expression friendly but slightly guarded. "David," he said, nodding towards him, "I heard you're offering some hospitality. You don't usually extend that to just anyone." Lily's heart sank. She knew she didn't belong here. She was a pawn in their world of power, business, and secrets, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could stand it. The sun had barely started to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the lush gardens of David Henderson's estate. Lily stood in the doorway of the guest house, gazing out over the manicured grounds. The beauty of it all was overwhelming. The sprawling estate, the lush greenery, the sprawling mansion, all of it was a stark reminder of the gap between David's world and hers. She was still trying to reconcile the life she had known, the constant struggle, with the ease that seemed to come so naturally to people like David. Sophie was napping, and David was busy with some business calls. Lily used the time to explore the house a little. She had been in the guest room for a few days now, trying to adjust, but there was an uneasiness in her that refused to fade. She couldn't shake the feeling that everything around her was too perfect, too good to be true. She felt as though she didn't belong here, and with every passing hour, the question of why David was helping her only grew more pressing. She wandered into the study, a room filled with towering shelves of books, antique furniture, and large windows that framed a breathtaking view of the estate. The room was quiet, almost reverent. As she explored the shelves, her hand brushed over a few old photo albums, their leather covers cracked with age. She hesitated before picking one up, curiosity drawing her in. Flipping through the pages, she came across photographs of David from his youth, playing with other children, family gatherings, the usual sorts of mementos. But then something caught her eye. In the middle of the album was a photograph that made her heart stop. It was an old black and white image of David and a man she recognized immediately. It was her father. The photograph was taken years ago, long before her father's fall from grace. He was younger, smiling, standing next to a boy who was clearly David, both of them dressed in suits, looking like the picture of innocence. There was no mistaking the familiarity between them, the same sharp jaw, the same confident smile. Her father's arm was draped around David's shoulders as if they were close friends, sharing a bond that Lily could never have imagined. Her mind raced. She stared at the photograph, her eyes scanning it again and again. It felt like a punch to the stomach. She wanted to believe it was just a coincidence, but she knew better. The world David lived in, the world her family had been a part of, was far more intertwined than she had ever realized. She felt the weight of the years pressing down on her years of bitterness, of struggles, of her family's decline. She had spent so much of her life trying to forget the past, to move on from the mistakes of others. But this brought it all rushing back. David's voice interrupted her thoughts. "You found it." She turned quickly, startled. He stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable, but his posture tense. Lily could feel her heart pounding in her chest. The room suddenly felt smaller, the distance between them unbearable. She didn't know what to say. The photograph in her hand felt like it was burning a hole in her palm. And for the first time since she had arrived, she felt a deep sense of betrayal. "I didn't mean for you to find that," David said softly, walking toward her. He looked down at the photo in her hand, his face momentarily softening with something close to regret. Lily swallowed hard, trying to find her voice. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell me that your family, that your father had something to do with all of this?" Her voice shook, not from fear, but from the weight of the revelation. "I've been trying to make sense of why you helped me, but now, this changes everything." David took a deep breath, stepping closer. "I wasn't trying to hide it. Lily, I just didn't know how to tell you." He paused, his gaze dropping to the floor as though he was weighing his words. "My father was involved in a lot of business dealings that affected your family." I knew it, but I didn't know the full extent of what happened. I've spent my whole life trying to make amends for what he did, trying to undo the damage he caused. Lily's heart pounded in her chest, but her anger wasn't the first thing that surfaced. It was the pain of betrayal, of discovering that the person she had begun to trust had ties to everything she had fought so hard to overcome. "You knew," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "and you never told me. You never told me about the connection between our families." David's face hardened for a moment, and then he sighed deeply, sitting down on the edge of a chair. "It's not something I'm proud of. Lily, my father's actions were unforgivable. But I'm not him. I'm not him, and I'm trying to fix what he broke." Lily stood there, motionless, her eyes locked on him. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust him. But the weight of the past, the years of bitterness and anger, were not so easily washed away by words. And deep down, she couldn't escape the thought that he had known all along. He had known about her family's struggles, about the downfall of her father. And yet, he still chose to help her. But why she took a step back, feeling the tension in her chest tightening. "I need to think," she said, her voice cold and distant. "I can't deal with this right now." David didn't protest. He simply watched her as she turned and walked toward the door, the heavy weight of their conversation hanging in the air. As Lily stepped into the hall, she glanced back, catching David's eyes from across the room. His face was a mask of regret, but his eyes were full of something else, something she couldn't place, something that made her hesitate. But she didn't look back. She couldn't. Not yet. She didn't want to believe it, but something inside her told her that this connection between their families would change everything. The days blurred together as Lily settled into her new surroundings. David's mansion was beautiful, unbelievably so, but it felt more like a dream than a home. She and Sophie had found a kind of routine. Lily would wake up early, try to make sense of the quiet life here, and Sophie would spend her days in the playroom, her laughter a balm for Lily's anxiety. Despite the luxury that surrounded them, Lily couldn't shake the unease. She had been helped, yes, but at what cost? And why David's gestures of kindness were constant. He had arranged for Sophie's care, ensured that Lily had everything she needed, and even began involving her in some of his charity work. At first, she resisted, feeling that it was too much, too soon, but over time, she came to see that he wasn't doing these things out of pity. No, there was something more to it, a genuine effort to help, to make a difference in her life and in the lives of others. One day, David invited Lily to join him at a community center event. It was a gathering of people who had benefited from David's charitable initiatives. As she walked through the room, Lily couldn't help but notice the pride in David's eyes as he spoke to the people. His role in their lives wasn't one of a distant benefactor, but of someone who truly cared. But it was during a conversation with a group of volunteers that Lily's world began to shift. The talk turned to the history of the community center and how it had come to be. One of the volunteers, a man named Ted, began recounting the struggles that many local businesses had faced in recent years. Lily had only been half listening until she heard a name that made her heart skip a beat. "They say that David's family's company was responsible for closing down half the small businesses in the area, including your father's," Ted said casually, looking over at Lily with a furrowed brow. "It's a damn shame. They never gave any of them a chance." Lily's blood ran cold. Her father's business, the one that had been her family's pride and joy, had gone bankrupt years ago. And now she was hearing that David's family had been the reason she wanted to argue, to defend him, to tell Ted that it couldn't possibly be true. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she felt the walls close in, the weight of the revelation sinking deep into her chest. She excused herself and made her way outside, the fresh air doing little to calm the storm inside her. She couldn't understand how David had never told her this. Had he known all along? Had he been aware that his family's actions had destroyed hers? Or was it something he was ashamed of? Something he couldn't face David, the man who had taken her in, who had given her and Sophie hope, was tied to the same world that had crushed her family. The thought was too much to bear. She had trusted him, had allowed herself to believe in him. And now, all of that trust felt like it was slipping through her fingers. Later that evening, when David returned to the house, Lily confronted him. "Why didn't you tell me?" Her voice trembled with hurt, a mix of disbelief and anger. "Why didn't you tell me about your family, about what they did to mine?" David looked at her, his face softening. "Lily, I never wanted to bring it up. It's a part of my past that I've been trying to distance myself from for years. My father made decisions that hurt a lot of people, including your family. I know that, but I'm not my father. I've tried to make things right. I've tried to help." Lily shook her head. "But you never told me. You never said anything about it. Why should I believe that this is all for real, that you're really trying to help?" David stepped closer, his expression pained. "I never wanted to burden you with this. You've already been through so much. I'm trying to do better, Lily. I'm trying to do right by you and Sophie." But Lily couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in her gut. It wasn't just about what David was doing now. It was about everything that had come before. She had never asked for help, and now she found herself entangled in a world that she didn't understand, a world that had been responsible for the destruction of her family. That night, as she lay in bed, her thoughts raced. She could feel Sophie's quiet breathing beside her, her little hand gripping Lily's in her sleep. How could she protect Sophie from all of this, from the complications that were beginning to surface? She didn't know how much more she could take. The next morning, things felt different. She couldn't look at David without seeing the connection between their families, the connection that had been buried for so long, hidden behind kindness and generosity. She wanted to trust him, to believe in the man who had taken them in. But the past had a way of creeping up on her, of reminding her that things were never as simple as they seemed. She walked into the living room that morning and found David standing by the window, his hands clasped behind his back. He didn't turn around when she entered, but there was something in his posture that made her feel like he was waiting for something. "I never wanted to hurt you," David said quietly, without looking at her. "I know I've made mistakes, but I can't change what happened. All I can do is try to make things better now. I want to help you, Lily, but I can't do it if you don't trust me." Lily stared at him for a long moment, the hurt still fresh, but the quiet sincerity in his voice gave her pause. Was this his way of trying to make things right, or was it all just a facade? She wasn't sure she could tell anymore. Her heart was heavy with doubt, but she knew one thing for sure: she couldn't keep running away from the truth. Whether or not she could trust David, whether or not he was truly trying to help, only time would tell. David looked up, his eyes meeting hers. "You don't have to decide now. I just want you to know that I'm here for you. Whatever you decide." Lily didn't say anything. She didn't know what to say. She only nodded slightly, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She walked out of the room, her thoughts clouded. And as she walked away, she saw David standing in the corner of the room, his face a mask of uncertainty. His gaze never left her, and for the first time, Lily wasn't sure what she would find if she allowed herself to look closer. The morning air was still cool as Lily arrived at Sophie's school, her heart beating faster than usual. She had been here several times, but today felt different. Today, David was with her. He had insisted on coming, despite her initial hesitation. He was taking a more active role in their lives now, no longer just a distant benefactor offering help from the sidelines. No, today, David Henderson was stepping into their world with all its imperfections and challenges. The school, a modest building nestled in a quiet part of Austin, Texas, wasn't anything like the grand halls of Henderson Holdings. It was small, the walls worn from years of use, the classrooms bursting with students eager to learn. The kind of place that required more than just money. It needed hands-on involvement, and David was here to give it. Lily had been reluctant at first, unsure about letting David into her world like this. She hadn't even known what he would do here, but he'd insisted. He wasn't there to be seen. to make a show of generosity. He simply wanted to help, to make things better, even in the smallest way. As they walked into the teacher's lounge, David immediately spotted the issues. The projector in one of the classrooms had malfunctioned, and there were computers that hadn't been updated in years. It was exactly the kind of work David had done in his business-solving problems, making things run smoothly. But this was different. These weren't high-end projects for his company. These were schools, real people, real lives, just trying to make do. David rolled up his sleeves and got to work, his movements deliberate as he examined the projector. Lily stood off to the side, watching him for a moment. She was used to seeing him in meetings, surrounded by other powerful figures in suits. But here, he was just a man helping a school make do. For a fleeting moment, she saw him as just another person, not the millionaire businessman he seemed to be. He was simply someone who cared enough to fix a broken projector. As the hours passed, Lily began to feel a subtle shift in her perception of him. She had always wondered if his kindness had strings attached, but as she watched him get his hands dirty and fix one thing after another, her doubts started to fade. He wasn't just doing this for show, he was genuinely helping, and in the process, he was starting to earn her trust. As they worked together, their conversations shifted from business to more personal topics. They talked about Sophie, about her hopes for her daughter's future, and the challenges of being a single mother. David shared little bits about his own life, things he'd never mentioned before his childhood, his strained relationship with his father, and the pressure of always living up to family expectations. It was the first time Lily had ever seen David open up in such a way, and for the first time, she felt like they were on equal ground. There was no wealth, no status. There was just two people, each trying to make the best of their circumstances. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, fixing one problem after another. And then, just as Lily thought the moment would pass without anything noteworthy, something shifted. She passed David a tool as they worked on the projector together, their hands brushing lightly against each other. The contact was brief, but it felt meaningful. It wasn't a spark of romance, not exactly, but it was a quiet understanding, a moment of genuine connection. The awkwardness between them, the distance created by their differences, seemed to dissolve in that small gesture. David looked at her, his face softening. "Thanks," he said, his voice lower than usual. "I couldn't have done this without your help." Lily smiled, a genuine smile that wasn't forced or out of obligation. "It's nothing," she replied. "We're a team, right?" For a moment, they stood there, staring at the projector. It was fixed. It worked, and so did they. Together, they had solved a problem, a small one, but a problem nonetheless. It was the first time Lily felt like she wasn't just a guest in David's world. They were partners in something real. As they continued working, Lily couldn't help but feel the weight of her earlier reservations beginning to lift. She had spent so long not trusting him, not trusting anyone. But here, in this room, she saw a different side to him, one she hadn't expected, but one that felt, for the first time, genuine. However, their quiet victory didn't last long. A voice from the door interrupted them, and Lily turned to see one of the teachers standing there, watching them with a bemused smile. "They look good together, don't they?" the teacher remarked, her tone light but pointed. Lily froze, feeling a flush rise in her cheeks. She hadn't thought about it that way, hadn't considered how they might appear to others. She glanced at David, but he didn't seem bothered by the comment. In fact, he just chuckled softly and shook his head, clearly unfazed by the observation. But Lily's heart raced. She hadn't meant for things to change like this. She hadn't meant to let her guard down. She didn't know what to make of it. Was she starting to trust David? Was that what this was? Was this connection between them real, or was it just a fleeting moment, something temporary? David caught her eye and gave her a reassuring smile, as if to say that everything was okay. He wasn't going to push her. He wasn't going to rush things. He had been patient, and he would continue to be. "Yeah," he said to the teacher with a grin. "We do make a good team, don't we?" Lily forced a small smile, but her mind was racing. She wasn't sure what was happening anymore. All she knew was that the distance she had felt between them before was beginning to close, little by little. She could feel the change in her, a softening of the walls she had built up so carefully. As the day came to a close, David and Lily stood outside the school, the sky turning a deep orange as the sun began to set. They had spent hours working together, and yet the task was far from over. There would be more to do, more challenges to face. But for the first time, Lily felt like they were facing them together, not as two people from different worlds, but as two people who had found common ground. David turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "I know I can't undo everything that's happened," he said, his voice quiet. "But I'm here, Lily. I'm here for you and Sophie. I just want to help." Lily looked at him, her heart heavy with the weight of her doubts. She didn't know what to say, how to respond, but she didn't have to. The quiet sincerity in his voice said everything she needed to hear. But even as she stood there, feeling something stir within her, a small part of her still couldn't forget the past. She wanted to trust him, to let go of the anger and the hurt. But how could she, when the past was never far behind? As they walked back to the car, Lily glanced at David. He was walking beside her, not ahead or behind, but beside her, and for the first time, it felt like they were walking the same path. Lily had spent countless days in the grand mansion, feeling like an outsider in the lavish surroundings. David's generosity was undeniable, but it didn't erase the uncomfortable feeling that clung to her, the feeling of being a guest in a world that wasn't hers. Despite the kindness he showed her, there was always the nagging sense that she didn't belong. The lives they led, David's and hers, felt like they belonged to two different universes. Her time spent volunteering at the community center had given her a sense of purpose. She could see the difference David was trying to make, and she admired his efforts. But as the days passed, there was an unspoken shift. The questions started. Whispers. People, his family, his friends, his colleagues started noticing the growing closeness between her and David. She didn't know whether she was ready for this. What would they think of her, a single mother, with nothing to her name except her daughter and the little bit of dignity she had left? It felt like an invitation for judgment, the same kind of judgment she had faced all her life, only now it was coming from a place she hadn't expected. David, on the other hand, appeared entirely unfazed. His composure remained unshaken, his confidence never faltering as he navigated the conversations with his family and associates. His ease was almost frustrating to Lily. How could he be so sure, so untroubled, while she was drowning in doubts? Was he aware of how out of place she felt? Did it even bother him? One evening, David invited Lily to dinner with his family. It was an event that had been carefully planned, and Lily knew that this was more than just a casual meal. It was a statement. The thought of walking into his world, his family's world, was enough to make her stomach churn. She wasn't sure if she was ready for it, but she had no choice. She couldn't turn him down, not without risking further alienation. When she arrived at the grand dining room, she was struck by the contrast. The room was enormous, adorned with rich tapestries and glistening chandeliers. The polished mahogany table gleamed under the soft glow of the overhead lights, and the guests, dressed in expensive suits and gowns, seemed so different. Their conversations flowed easily, full of laughter and lively chatter. The men spoke of investments and business ventures, while the women discussed fashion and social gatherings. Everyone seemed so comfortable, so confident in their world. And then there was Lily, sitting at the edge of the table, feeling the weight of her own insecurities. She could feel their eyes on her, the quiet judgment that lingered just beneath the surface. She tried to keep her posture straight, her hands resting delicately in her lap, but the feeling of being an outsider was suffocating. Her fingers tightened around the glass of water in front of her, the only anchor in a room full of strangers. David, as usual, was the center of attention. His calm demeanor, his quiet confidence. It was everything Lily had come to know about him. But tonight, it felt different. She could see the way his family looked at him, with adoration and respect, and she felt the weight of her own difference. She was no longer just an outsider in his world. She was a single mother, with a past, with baggage, sitting at the same table as some of the most influential people in Texas. And then, as if sensing her discomfort, David turned to her, offering her a reassuring smile. "Don't worry," he said softly, his voice just above a whisper. "You're not alone here." But his words felt hollow. It wasn't enough to erase the fact that she didn't belong. She had been invited to his world, but she couldn't help but wonder if she was merely an experiment to him, a way to prove to himself that he could be kind, that he could care. The dinner continued, but Lily's mind wandered. She watched as his family talked about their vacations, their business successes, and their social status. It was all so foreign to her. Her own life was a far cry from this. It wasn't just the wealth that set them apart. It was the way they saw the world, how they talked about their lives, their futures. They were assured, so confident in who they were. They were people of importance, people who had always had power. And then there was her, a woman who had been cast aside by her own family, someone who had to fight for every small thing she had. She wasn't sure if she could keep pretending to be someone she wasn't. This wasn't her world. And as much as David tried to pull her into it, she knew that no amount of kindness could change the fact that she was still an outsider here. Later, as the dinner began to wind down, David stood up and excused himself for a moment. Lily felt a wave of relief wash over her. Finally, a chance to escape the suffocating feeling of being in the wrong place. She made her way to the balcony, stepping outside into the cool night air. She leaned against the railing, taking a deep breath, trying to calm the storm that had been building inside her all evening. The city lights below flickered like stars, and for a moment, she felt the weight of it all, the pressure of living in David's world, the unease of not knowing where she truly belonged. And then she heard footsteps behind her. She didn't have to turn around to know who it was. David stood next to her, his presence strong yet gentle. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, his hands in his pockets, staring out over the city with her. Finally, he spoke. "I know this isn't easy for you," he said, his voice low and steady. "But I want you to understand something. Lily, this isn't about me helping you out of pity. I'm not doing this to prove something to anyone. I'm doing this because I believe you deserve a chance to live without fear, without the weight of the past." Lily turned to look at him, her heart heavy with emotions she couldn't quite name. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust him. But how could she let go of the past, of the pain, and trust that someone like him, someone who had everything, could truly understand David? She began, her voice faltering. "I don't belong here. I don't belong in your world. It's too different. I'm not one of you." David looked at her, his eyes unwavering. "You don't have to be like everyone else. You just have to be you. That's all I'm asking for." His words hung in the air, but Lily wasn't sure she could accept them. She wasn't sure she could trust him or herself to let go of the past. But then, in a soft whisper, he said, "Come into my world. Lily, just for a little while. Let me show you that there's more to this life than what you've known." She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond, but she found herself nodding, if only a little, agreeing to step into his world, even if just for a moment. Lily had been to her fair share of gatherings, but nothing prepared her for this. The ballroom at the exclusive venue in downtown Austin glittered with chandeliers, and the walls were adorned with expensive art. She could smell the scent of aged wine and polished wood, a mixture that only rich people's homes had, the kind of scent that made her feel like an intruder. The guests were dressed in suits and gowns that cost more than she made in a year. They spoke in hushed tones, their laughter rich and effortless. It was a world she didn't belong in, a world she hadn't known existed until now. David, however, was right at home. His tall frame stood out among the crowd, his confident smile drawing people in, but it wasn't his presence that made her uncomfortable. It was the feeling that no matter how much he tried to make her feel welcomed, she would always be an outsider in this space. His world, the world of power and privilege, was something she would never truly be able to comprehend. She stood by the refreshment table, trying to keep her head low and not draw too much attention. She didn't belong here. She didn't belong among these people who seemed so sure of themselves, who had everything handed to them while she had fought for every scrap of comfort in her life. She had lived on the fringes of society, struggling to stay afloat, always trying to make ends meet for Sophie. And yet, here she was, at a lavish party thrown by one of the richest men in Texas. She was both grateful and terrified, grateful for the chance David had given her and Sophie, but terrified that she would be swallowed whole by this unfamiliar world. As she wandered around the room, she couldn't help but overhear snippets of conversation, names and brands that meant nothing to her, followed by words she didn't understand. A part of her felt a pang of jealousy. What had she done to deserve this life? Why should she get to enjoy all of this, while others like her struggled for the simplest things? David appeared at her side, his smile as charming as ever, but there was something in his eyes, a glint that made Lily uneasy. "Lily, come on. Let me introduce you to some people," he said, his tone light and inviting. Sure," she replied, her voice strained, but she followed him nonetheless. She was beginning to feel like a fish out of water, and the only thing that kept her going was David. At least, he seemed to believe in her. They walked over to a small group of people gathered near the corner of the room. The men and women immediately turned their attention to David, their eyes lighting up in his presence. Lily could feel the weight of their gaze, sizing her up, taking in her modest dress, her unpolished look. She was certain they could smell the difference between them from miles away. As David introduced her to everyone, she tried to smile, to hold herself with confidence. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong. They talked about business, about expensive vacations, about who had the best designer wardrobe. It all seemed so trivial compared to the things Lily valued. Her world was one of survival, of sacrifice, of doing whatever it took to protect Sophie. And then, just as she was beginning to feel like she would disappear into the shadows, a conversation shifted, and Lily heard her name. "I've heard about you, Lily," a woman said, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "You're the one David took in." "Right." Her eyes narrowed as she looked Lily up and down, her smile too wide, too fake. Before Lily could respond, David's voice cut through the conversation like a sharp knife. "That's enough, Claire," he said, his tone firm, yet calm. "She's a guest here, and I won't have anyone disrespecting her. You may be used to your privileged little world, but Lily deserves respect. You will give her that. Understand?" Lily felt her cheeks flush with heat. For a moment, she was too stunned to react. David had stepped in, protecting her. But why? Was it because he truly cared? Or was it just another way to keep up appearances? She looked at him, his jaw set, his eyes unwavering as he faced down the woman who had dared to make her feel small. His actions, his protection of her, spoke volumes. But still, something nagged at her. She didn't know if she could truly trust him. The room fell silent for a beat, and then people awkwardly cleared their throats and moved on. The tension hung in the air for just a moment longer before it dissipated. But Lily couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort. She wanted to thank David, to tell him that it meant something to her, but the words caught in her throat. She didn't belong here, and she wasn't sure if anything could change that. As they walked away from the group, David leaned in close. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft, with a hint of concern. Lily nodded, her throat tight. "Yeah, I just don't know if I'll ever fit in here." David's expression softened, and he placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "You don't have to fit in, Lily. You just have to be you." His words were simple, but there was sincerity in them. She forced a smile, trying to convince herself that maybe, just maybe, there was something real behind his gestures, but the truth lingered in her mind. She was still an outsider, and no matter how much she wanted to believe in David, the gulf between them, between their worlds, felt as wide as ever. As they moved through the crowd, something in her mind clicked. She remembered the name Rivera, one of the many names David had casually mentioned earlier in the evening, a name she had heard before. It was the name of a company her father had once worked for, the same company that had been one of the many responsible for the downfall of her family's business years ago. A sudden wave of unease washed over her. Rivera, she thought, the name echoing in her mind. She had heard it in connection with her father's failed venture, the one that had left them penniless. The same people who had ruined their lives were somehow connected to David. The suspicion crept into her thoughts, filling her with a mix of anger and disbelief. Could it be, was David truly unaware of the impact his family had on hers, or had he been a part of the reason her father had lost everything? Lily didn't say anything, but her mind was racing. Could she trust him? Could she trust anyone in this world? The question loomed over her, unresolved. And as they left the party, David's hand still resting gently on her shoulder, she knew that their connection was more complicated than she had ever imagined. Lily's trust in David had been building slowly, a delicate balance between gratitude and skepticism, between the kindness he showed her and the nagging doubts in the back of her mind. She couldn't ignore the difference between their worlds, the world of wealth and privilege he belonged to, and the life of hardship and struggle she had known all too well. But despite the disparity, there was something about him that made her believe, even if, just for a moment, that maybe there was more to his kindness than appearances suggested. Maybe he was genuinely trying to help her, to make up for the past mistakes his family had made, or perhaps it was simply compassion for a woman in need. Yet, her instincts told her to be cautious. Her father's fall from grace still haunted her, and every time she allowed herself to get closer to David, the ghosts of the past seemed to come creeping back. What if his family was somehow involved in her father's downfall? What if there was more to David than he let on? The truth hit her like a cold slap. One ordinary morning, when Lily found herself eavesdropping on an unexpected conversation. She was in the kitchen, preparing coffee, trying to push away the ever-present anxiety that had been clinging to her for days. She hadn't seen David much the past few days. He'd been busy with work, and she had found solace in a quiet routine of caring for Sophie and settling into her new life at the house. It was a fragile peace, one that felt like it could be shattered at any moment. But today, as she passed the living room, she heard David's voice. He was speaking with a man she didn't recognize, someone who had come to visit him. It was the kind of casual conversation one might have in their own home. But Lily couldn't help but overhear when the subject shifted. "I still can't believe your old man did that to her family," the man said, his tone gruff but filled with an edge of sympathy. The Rivera family, what they did to Lily's father, it ruined him. Lily froze in the doorway, the cup of coffee she had been holding slipping slightly in her hands. Her pulse quickened. Rivera. The name sent a sharp chill down her spine. Her father's business had collapsed, and Rivera Enterprises had been involved in the decision to pull the rug out from under them. The Rivera family had been the ones to force her father out of business, leaving him penniless, unable to provide for his family. She leaned against the doorframe, trying to steady herself. But her mind raced, her heart hammering in her chest. David's father. It had to be him. His family had been the ones behind the destruction of her father's life, the ones who had taken everything from them. David was the son of the man who had caused her family's downfall. Her legs felt weak, and she struggled to remain standing. The man's voice faded as David responded. "I wasn't involved in that," David said softly, but Lily didn't hear the rest of his words. She didn't need to. The revelation had already hit her like a freight train, tearing apart every piece of trust she had been building with him. David wasn't just a wealthy philanthropist who had come to her aid. He was the son of the very person who had destroyed her father's life. How could she have not seen it sooner? How could she have allowed herself to get close to him, to believe that he was any different from the people who had ruined her family? The tears began to well up in her eyes, and she could feel them spilling down her cheeks. She wiped them away quickly, ashamed of herself for letting her emotions get the best of her. But the betrayal was too much to bear. Everything she had believed about David, everything she had allowed herself to feel for him, had been a lie. She had trusted him, and now she felt like a fool. Her hands trembled as she stepped back from the doorway, her heart aching with the weight of this new truth. She had to get out. She couldn't stay here. Not now. Not after what she had just learned. She needed to leave, to get away from him and his family. She couldn't stay in a house that was filled with the remnants of her father's broken dreams. She turned quickly, her mind already racing with plans to pack and leave, to take Sophie and start over somewhere else, anywhere else. But as she reached the door, she heard David's voice again, this time from behind her. "Lily, please don't go," he said, his voice thick with emotion. She froze, her hand on the doorknob, and turned around slowly. There he stood, standing in the hallway, his face pale, his eyes searching hers. He looked like a man who had just been stripped of everything, like someone who had just realized the enormity of the mistake they had made. "I can't let you leave like this," he continued, his voice soft, almost pleading. "There's so much I need to explain. Please, don't walk out on me now." Lily felt the walls she had built around herself start to crumble. Her mind was a whirlpool of emotions, her heart torn between anger and confusion, between betrayal and a yearning for the connection she had once felt with him. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw something that made her falter. He wasn't just trying to keep her from leaving, he was trying to make things right. She could see the sincerity in his face. But was it enough? Could she forgive him for the sins of his family? "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The words hurt to say, but they were true. The pain of what she had just learned was too much to bear, and she didn't know if she could move past it. She wanted to. She wanted to believe in him, to believe that there was something real between them. But could she? David took a step forward, his expression filled with regret. "Lily, I'm not my father," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I never wanted this. I never wanted to hurt you. Please, let me explain. Let me show you who I am." She shook her head, her tears falling freely now. "I don't know if I can trust you anymore," she whispered. And with that, she turned away and walked out of the room, leaving him standing there, alone with the weight of his family's history and the pain of her broken trust. Lily hadn't expected David's persistence. After the devastating revelation, she had withdrawn completely from him, unable to bear the weight of her own emotions, let alone the pressure of facing him again. He had shattered the fragile trust she had started to build, and now the walls around her heart felt like the only protection she had left. She didn't want to hear his apologies or excuses, but David, stubborn and unyielding, didn't let her slip away so easily, every day. He reached out with little gestures, leaving her notes of encouragement, finding subtle ways to show he was still there for her. Yet none of it seemed to matter. She didn't want his help. She didn't want anything from him. Her anger burned brightly, more so with every passing day. She couldn't understand how he could be so blind to the destruction his family had caused. And to her, it wasn't something that could simply be undone with a few kind words or charitable acts. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him to stay away, but the hurt was so deep that she couldn't even bring herself to speak to him. But David didn't give up. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began using his wealth and influence to make amends in ways she never could have expected. He started with the community he had grown up, in the very same community that had suffered at the hands of his family's business dealings. The Rivera family had built their empire by taking down those who stood in their way. But now, David was trying to undo that legacy. He set up a foundation, a nonprofit aimed at revitalizing the neighborhoods his family had once destroyed, using the wealth that had come from his father's empire to heal the wounds they had left behind. At first, Lily didn't notice. She was too consumed by her own pain, too caught up in her own battles to even consider what David was doing. But then, one afternoon, as she walked through the old district where she and her father had once lived, she saw a banner hanging outside a rundown community center. The banner read, "Rivera Foundation, giving back to those who need it most." Her stomach twisted, and her breath caught in her throat. The irony was unbearable. David had used the same name, the Rivera name, to build his own empire, but now he was using it to repair the damage that had been done. Was this his way of atoning for the past? Was this his way of trying to make things right? She didn't know, but something in her heart began to stir, a flicker of hope, quickly extinguished by her own rage. She wanted to believe that he was doing this for the right reasons, but how could she trust someone who had been born into the very system that had taken everything from her? David's efforts continued. He visited the families who had lost everything because of his father's business decisions. He listened to their stories, offered financial assistance, and helped rebuild the lives that had been shattered. It was clear to anyone who knew him that David wasn't doing this for recognition or accolades. He wasn't trying to buy forgiveness with money. No, he was doing it because he understood, perhaps for the first time in his life, that he had a responsibility to make things right. And it was this understanding, this recognition of responsibility, that began to slowly chip away at the walls Lily had built. She couldn't deny the sincerity in his actions. She couldn't deny that he was doing something his father never would have done, but at the same time, she couldn't escape the anger that still burned in her chest. The past wasn't something she could just forget. The scars of what had happened to her family ran deep, and no matter how much David tried to fix things, those scars would never completely heal. One evening, as Lily sat in her living room, lost in her thoughts, the phone rang. It was her mother, Lily. Her mother's voice came through the line, shaky but firm. "He's here, David. He came by to speak with me." Lily's heart skipped a beat. She knew exactly who her mother was talking about. She had heard nothing from David in weeks, and though she had been avoiding him, a part of her wondered if he would ever give up on trying to fix what was broken. Now, here he was, standing in front of her mother, not asking for forgiveness, but simply giving her what he thought was owed. "What did he want?" Lily asked, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. Her mother paused for a moment, then answered, "He didn't ask for forgiveness. He just handed me a check big enough to cover your father's debts. He said it was the least he could do." Lily's mind spun. Her father's debts had been his burden until the day he died. And now, David was stepping in, offering the solution her father had never been able to find. But it wasn't the money that shocked her. It was the realization that David, in his own way, was trying to atone for something he hadn't even caused, trying to heal the wounds of a past that had been so far beyond his control. "Do you want me to take it?" her mother asked. Lily sat in silence for a moment, her thoughts a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She felt the weight of her father's memory, the deep sense of loss that had shaped so much of her life. She felt the sting of betrayal and anger, but she also felt something else, a strange sense of peace. "No," she finally said, her voice low. "I don't want him to think that money can fix what's broken." Her mother was silent for a moment, then whispered, "He's doing what he thinks is right. And sometimes, that's all we can ask for." As the conversation ended, Lily sat in the silence of her room, her heart torn between the desire for justice and the realization that some things couldn't be fixed with money or grand gestures. Healing, she knew, would take time that she wasn't sure she was ready to give. But David, with all his faults, with all his family's history, had begun to show her something she hadn't expected: the possibility of redemption, not through words, but through actions. The next morning, she drove to the community center that David had helped rebuild, unsure of what she was looking for, but knowing that she couldn't avoid the truth any longer. She parked the car and walked up to the door, feeling the weight of her decisions pressing down on her. When she stepped inside, she saw David talking to a group of volunteers, his back to her. He turned when he heard the door open, and for a brief moment, their eyes locked. She didn't know what she felt anymore. She didn't know if she could forgive him for the past, but what she did know was that he had changed. And perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way forward, one step at a time. He looked at her, and she could see the vulnerability in his eyes. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said softly, "but I want you to know. I'm trying to do what's right." Lily nodded, her heart heavy with 1,000 emotions. She didn't know if she could forgive him yet, but she knew that the road to healing had begun, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was hope. The days since the confrontation had passed in a blur, each one heavy with thoughts and questions Lily couldn't seem to answer. David had tried to reach out, to explain, but Lily remained distant, consumed by a storm of conflicting emotions. He was not the man she had once thought him to be, but she wasn't sure who he was now. There were moments, fleeting as they were, when she felt the shift, when she realized she couldn't hold on to the anger as tightly as before. It was as if something within her was beginning to bend, something fragile, yet undeniable. But even though the cracks in her anger were starting to show, she couldn't bring herself to forgive him. How could she? David's family had been responsible for destroying hers. His father's decisions had crushed everything her father had worked for. And yet, here David stood, trying to atone for sins that weren't even his own. He hadn't created the system, but he had been born into it, benefiting from it. How could he just step out of his father's shadow? How could she trust him when his very presence reminded her of everything that had been taken from her? David had made attempts to show her his sincerity, but no matter what he did, the distance remained. His charity work, his attempts to help the people his father had wronged, it wasn't enough. There was no way to erase the past, no way to undo the damage that had been done. And yet, there was something in the way he looked at her, in the quietness of his actions, that made her wonder. Maybe he was different. Maybe he was trying, in the only way he knew how. One evening, as Lily sat in her kitchen, sipping her coffee and watching the sun dip low in the sky, she heard the soft sound of the doorbell. A knock at this hour. It could only be David. She had been expecting this, in some way, but even now, with his persistent attempts, she wasn't sure she was ready for the conversation that might come. She had heard it all, the apologies, the offers of help, the quiet gestures of kindness, but they hadn't worked. They hadn't bridged the gap between their worlds. They hadn't healed the wound that had been carved so deeply into her life. With a hesitant breath, she opened the door. David stood there, his expression more serious than usual. She could see the weight of something in his eyes, a burden he was ready to share. "Lily, can we talk?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with a vulnerability she hadn't heard before. She nodded, stepping aside to let him in, though every part of her was screaming to shut the door and walk away. But this time, she stayed. This time, she was willing to listen. They sat down at the kitchen table, the space between them filled with an unspoken tension. Lily kept her gaze fixed on the table, unwilling to look at him, afraid of what she might see in his face. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," David began, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm not asking for your trust or your acceptance, but I think you need to know the truth, the whole truth." Lily remained silent, her heart pounding in her chest. She had heard the words before, the apologies, the pleas for understanding, but this felt different. This felt like something he had been holding on to, something he hadn't yet shared. Her curiosity got the better of her, and she met his gaze for the first time in days. There was a deep sadness in his eyes, a reflection of the same pain that lived inside her. "My father," David continued, his voice breaking slightly. "He was the one who pushed your family into bankruptcy. He was the one who made the decisions that led to your father's downfall. And I've spent years trying to distance myself from his legacy. I've spent years fighting against what he stood for, trying to live differently, trying to do better, but I can't change what he did. I can't take that away." The words hit Lily like a tidal wave. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. She had known, in some part of her heart, that David's family had to be responsible for the pain she'd felt all her life. But to hear him say it, to hear him admit that his own blood had been the cause of her suffering, it was like something inside her snapped. "I didn't choose that," David went on, his voice growing more passionate, his hands tightening around the edges of the table. "I didn't choose my father's path, and I don't want to live in his shadow anymore. I've tried to make things right, in whatever way I can, but I know that doesn't fix the past. I can't erase it. I can only move forward. Lily felt her throat tighten, her emotions swirling in a whirlpool of rage and confusion. Everything she had believed about David had just been shattered. And yet, she felt something else, too. A flicker of something like understanding. A sense that maybe, just maybe, there was more to this man than she had given him credit for. I don't know what to believe anymore, she said, her voice trembling slightly. How can I trust you when everything I've known tells me you're part of the problem? How can I believe that you're trying to fix something that was never yours to fix? David didn't respond immediately. Instead, he just looked at her, his eyes searching for something. Because, Lily, he said softly, I'm not my father. I'm trying to make a difference, even if it's too late, and I can't undo what's been done. But I can promise you, I'm not the man I was before. I'm not him, and I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm just asking you to see me for who I am now. Lily's heart clenched as she listened to his words. There was a raw honesty in his voice, a sincerity that cut through the walls she had built so carefully around herself. She didn't know if she could forgive him not yet, but she could feel something changing inside her, something that had been locked away for so long. I don't know if I can forgive you, she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. But I don't want to forget you either. David's face softened at her words, a quiet relief washing over him. That's all I can ask for. For the first time in what felt like forever, Lily allowed herself to feel something other than anger. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a beginning, a chance to let go of the past, even if it was just for a moment. As David stood to leave, he paused at the door, turning to face her one last time. I'll be here, whenever you're ready, he said quietly. Lily watched him leave, her heart torn between the past and the future. She didn't know if she could fully trust him. She didn't know if she could ever forgive him, but something had shifted, something had changed. And for the first time in a long while, Lily let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, there was hope. The weeks following the charity event had been a blur for Lily. She hadn't expected the project she and David were working on to be such a lifeline, not just for the people they were helping, but for themselves. There were days when it felt like the weight of everything that had happened between them was just a little lighter. As they focused on the community project, a shared goal began to heal the rift between them slowly, gently, but undeniably. It wasn't about love, at least, not yet. Lily had learned not to rush things, not to try to force her feelings into something they weren't ready to be. But there was something about the way David worked, about his dedication, his effort to make things right, that started to undo the bitterness in her heart. She saw, for the first time, that the man she'd been angry with was not the same man standing beside her now. This David, the one who worked tirelessly for others, the one who cared deeply for what was right, was someone she could respect. Perhaps she could trust him again. But love, that was still a mountain too steep to climb. Their days were filled with meetings, organizing resources, and speaking to people who would benefit from the project. There were long hours spent planning, a rhythm developing between them, a pattern of cooperation that started to feel natural. They were building something together, something bigger than their past misunderstandings. One afternoon, as they stood together at the community center, watching the first batch of food and supplies being distributed, Lily felt a tug at her heart. It was a quiet moment, one that had nothing to do with David's wealth or her own pain. It was about what they were accomplishing, together. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of pride, not just for herself, but for them as a team. They were doing something good, something real. David caught her eye, and for a brief second, their gazes locked. It wasn't the intense gaze of the past, filled with unspoken emotions. It was different. It was softer, more understanding, like they were finally on the same page. They didn't need to say anything. The work they had done together spoke volumes. You know, David said quietly, as the crowd began to disperse. I've never been prouder of anything I've done. Lily didn't respond right away. but her smile was enough. "It's good, isn't it?" she said softly. "To be doing something that matters." He nodded, his expression serious. "It is, and I don't want to stop." "I know I've made mistakes, Lily, but I want to make things right, make a real difference, no matter how small. I want to be someone who helps, not just with money, but with actions. I want to help make your life better, too." Her heart skipped, but she didn't let it show. Not yet. There was still too much unresolved between them, but she couldn't deny the quiet stirring inside her. She could see his sincerity now, even if the past still loomed large. As the evening went on, Lily felt a rare sense of peace settling over her. It was the kind of peace that came with knowing she was doing the right thing, both for herself and for others. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel the weight of resentment hanging over her. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was a step forward, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Later that evening, as Lily sat at her kitchen table, a soft ping broke the silence. She glanced at her phone, surprised to see a message from one of her students. "Oh, when is Mr. Ethan coming back?" Lily smiled to herself, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. The message wasn't important in the grand scheme of things, but it was a reminder of something she hadn't realized she'd been missing. The connection, the work she had been doing, the people she was helping, it all mattered. But the little moments like this, the ones that reminded her of why she had started this journey in the first place, they were the moments that truly kept her going. She typed a quick reply, telling her student she would be back soon, but for some reason, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in her life. It wasn't just the project or the community, it was David. It was the way he had been there, quietly proving himself, doing the work. It was the way he cared, without expecting anything in return. Lily leaned back in her chair, taking a deep breath, her heart a little lighter. She wasn't sure what the future held, but in this moment, for the first time in a long while, she was beginning to feel like there was hope. But just as she was lost in the thought, her phone buzzed again, pulling her back to reality. David had sent her a message. "I think they're starting to notice," he wrote, along with a picture of the event. In the background, she could see people gathering, chatting, some even laughing, surrounded by the work they'd done. Lily glanced at the photo. Then, her eyes moved to the message again. She felt the tiniest pull of something new in her heart, but she wasn't ready to name it yet. That was when she heard it, the soft murmur of a conversation from the corner of the room. One of the volunteers was talking to someone else, and Lily couldn't help but overhear the question, "Do you think there's something going on between them?" Her heart skipped, and she looked up, startled. They hadn't done anything to invite that kind of assumption. Not really, but it was clear that the attention was inevitable. Their shared moments, the work, the subtle changes they had been noticed. And now, the world outside of their little bubble was starting to question it. Lily felt a wave of unease, but it wasn't just the external pressure that made her hesitate. It was her own uncertainty, the lingering doubts about her place in David's world, about what it meant for her future. She didn't know how to navigate this. She glanced over at David, who was talking to another volunteer. He was smiling, looking so confident, so at ease in this world that was nothing like her own. For a moment, she wondered if he even understood the weight of what she was feeling. She wanted to reach out, to say something, to ask him how he could be so sure of all of this. But she held back. "You don't have to do this," she whispered under her breath, but the words weren't for him. They were for herself. Still, there was that question hanging in the air. Do they have something going on? Her mind couldn't help but wonder, as her heart wrestled with the weight of it all. Lily hadn't expected the moment to catch her so off guard. The sun was setting on the community center, casting long shadows over the gathering of families and volunteers who had come together to celebrate the progress they'd made. It was a modest ceremony, a simple token of appreciation for all the work done in the past months, but there was something about it that felt different. Lily felt proud, but the pride was mingled with an uneasy sense of change. She glanced at David, who was standing beside her, smiling as he exchanged pleasantries with a few of the local leaders. He looked natural in this environment, a stark contrast to the first day they'd worked together. Back then, she had seen him as an outsider, a rich man stepping into a world he knew little about. But now, standing among the people who respected him for his actions rather than his wealth, it was hard to deny that David had become a fixture in this place, in their lives. Lily watched as David chatted with a group of children, his laughter carrying easily across the courtyard. He had been a key part of everything they were building, but it wasn't just his generosity that had changed things. It was the small moments, his quiet involvement, the way he listened, the way he cared. She had started to see him less as an outsider and more as someone she could trust. But then it happened. A little girl, probably no more than 6 or 7, walked up to David with a shy smile and tugged on his sleeve. Without hesitation, she called out, "Daddy." The word stopped Lily in her tracks. Her heart skipped, a ripple of confusion washing over her. David froze for just a split second, his smile faltering. He looked at the child, his expression soft but cautious. Then, with a quick glance toward Lily, he kneeled down to the little girl, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Hey, sweetie," he said warmly, though his voice had a subtle tremor. "How's everything going?" Lily couldn't tear her eyes away. She could see the vulnerability in David's face, something she hadn't noticed before. It was the kind of look someone wore when they were forced to confront a piece of their past that they weren't quite ready to face. The little girl's mother, standing nearby, approached and apologized with a soft laugh. "I'm sorry," she said. "She calls you that sometimes. David, she's very fond of you." Lily's pulse quickened. She tried to make sense of what had just happened. David's relationship with this child, this young girl, did it mean something more? Had she missed something? How deep did this go? Was there something she didn't know about his life, about his family? She turned away, needing a moment to collect herself. The world around her continued, but her thoughts were a whirlwind. Her mind raced, trying to process the significance of the moment. A child had called him Dad. It was such an innocent, unguarded thing, but it felt like a reminder of the distance between their worlds. David was a man who could afford to step in and be a father figure. And here she was, still holding on to a version of him that was shaped by her own past, by everything he and his family had taken from hers. For the first time, she realized how deeply he had infiltrated her life. She had thought that she was merely working alongside him, helping with the project. But David was already in her world, in Sophie's world. The walls she had so carefully built around her heart walls that had been reinforced by years of bitterness were beginning to crack. She could no longer deny it. David was more than just a partner in this project. He was slowly becoming a part of their everyday lives, in ways she hadn't imagined. She felt a hand on her shoulder. David had approached her quietly, his presence grounding in a way she hadn't expected. "Lily," he said, his voice soft, careful. "You okay?" She nodded, trying to swallow the sudden lump in her throat. "Yeah," she managed, just thinking. David studied her for a long moment. Then, as though he could read the thoughts swirling in her mind, he sighed. "I'm sorry about that. I know it probably caught you off guard." Lily turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "David, it's not about that. It's just..." She faltered, unsure of how to voice the things she was feeling. "You're not the person I thought you were. But in some ways, that's a good thing. I'm just not sure where I fit in all of this." David's gaze softened, and for the first time in a long while, he looked vulnerable. "Lily, I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to be the person you thought I was. I don't expect forgiveness from you. But I want you to know I'm here, really here, not just for the project, but for you and for Sophie." Her heart clenched. She knew this wasn't an easy thing for him to say. And even though part of her wanted to push him away, to remind him of all the wrongs he had been complicit in, Another part of her, a part she hadn't realized, was beginning to believe him. "You're doing all this because you feel responsible," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "But it's not just about that, is it? You want to make a real difference, to change, to be someone better." He nodded slowly. "Yes, Lily. It's about more than just making up for the past. It's about building something good. I want to help. I want to be someone who does the right thing, no matter how difficult that is." Lily felt the warmth of his words, but they didn't erase the uncertainty in her heart. She wanted to believe him, truly. But a part of her still clung to the past, to the anger that had kept her safe all these years. She wasn't ready to forgive him, not yet, but she couldn't deny that something inside her was starting to thaw. For a brief moment, they stood there in silence, the noise of the celebration around them fading into the background. Lily's thoughts were still clouded, but as she looked at David, really looked at him, she realized something. She hadn't been able to trust him before, but now, standing here, she wasn't so sure that she wanted to let him go. "I'm not sure when I started to trust you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I think I do now. I'm not ready to forgive everything yet. But I think I can try." David's expression softened further, his lips curving into a small, tentative smile. "That's all I need. Lily, I'll wait, as long as it takes." But just as Lily was about to say something, a voice cut through the crowd, a familiar voice, one she hadn't expected to hear at this event. "Hey, you two." It was one of the volunteers from the project, someone who had been helping from the start. "You guys got something going on? Or are you just friends?" Lily's breath caught in her throat. Her gaze snapped to David's, but he was already looking at her with a resigned smile. It wasn't the first time they'd been asked this question. But this time, the words felt heavier, more real. Lily knew that things were changing. But what did that mean for them? Were they just two people working together for a cause, or was there something more between them? And if there was, what did it mean for the future they were building together? The weight of the world seemed to bear down on Lily and David with each passing day. Their quiet, growing connection, something that had begun with the hum of shared projects and late-night talks about the future, was now being scrutinized by everyone. What had once felt like a safe, private space for them was now exposed to the judgment of the world. What began as whispers behind closed doors slowly transformed into pointed remarks in boardrooms, at social gatherings, and through the countless news outlets eager to tear apart the lives of the people who made headlines. The shift had been subtle at first. Lily could sense it when they'd walk into a room together, eyes lingering a little too long, the conversations that stopped when they entered. What had once been casual glances or smiles had become guarded stares, whispers that barely masked their judgment. As much as Lily hated to admit it, she was starting to feel the tension that David had lived with for so long. It was inescapable, suffocating. David, though, didn't seem fazed by the mounting pressure. He still smiled his easy smile, greeted people with the same friendly demeanor, and carried on with the work they had started. Lily admired his strength, but it didn't shield her from the brunt of the criticism. She was constantly reminded of how far removed she was from his world. She didn't belong there, at least. Not yet. Not in the way he did. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling series of meetings with partners and stakeholders, Lily and David sat together in the office. The windows were open, and the breeze coming in was a welcome relief from the heated atmosphere inside. David leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes as he spoke. "Things are getting harder," he said quietly, his voice betraying the frustration that had been building in him all week. "I can feel the pressure, and it's not just from my family anymore. It's the board, our investors, the partners. They don't get it. They're questioning everything. Our commitment, our motives. They want me to choose between you and the company, between everything I've worked for and, well, you." Lily swallowed, trying to keep her composure. The idea of David having to make that choice felt like a punch to the gut. She didn't want to be the reason for his downfall, for his loss. But at the same time, she couldn't help but feel that he had sacrificed so much already. His reputation, his ties to his family, everything he had ever known, it was all hanging in the balance. "I can't ask you to choose, David," she said softly, her heart heavy. "This isn't fair to you. You've worked too hard for this life. I've seen it." David turned to face her, his expression serious but warm. "No, Lily, it's not about asking. It's about me deciding what's more important to me. And I've made my decision. You matter to me. What we're doing, the work, the people we're building something bigger than any of this. I'm not going to let anyone tear that down. Not again." The words lingered between them, heavy and charged. There was so much she wanted to say, but she could see the determination in his eyes, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel the need to say anything at all. She trusted him in a way she hadn't been able to before. There was strength in his resolve that was contagious, even if the odds were stacked against them. The next day, they had another board meeting. Lily didn't plan to attend, but she was asked to be present when the discussion about the community project was brought up. David had been under the spotlight before, but this time felt different. The board was tense, their body language closed off, their words sharper than usual. David sat at the head of the table, looking unflinching as he faced the growing discontent. "David," one of the senior members of the board spoke, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "We need a decision. This project, this relationship is becoming a liability. You're leading us into uncharted territory. And now we hear there's something personal between you and your colleague, Miss Anderson. What will it be? Will you continue down this path of personal entanglement, or will you focus on the company? We need clarity." The room fell silent. Lily could feel the eyes of the board on her, their judgment so thick she could almost taste it. She hadn't wanted to be part of this conversation, but somehow, there she was, caught in the middle of a decision that could affect them both. David didn't flinch. He didn't shrink under the weight of their scrutiny. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice steady and strong. "I'm not choosing between the company and Lily," David said, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. "I'm not choosing between what's right and what's easy. If you think I'll just let you tear apart what we've built together, you're wrong. I've spent my life building this company, but I've also spent my life learning from the mistakes of those before me. I'm not going to make the same mistake." A murmur rippled through the room. The tension escalated, but David wasn't backing down. His eyes swept across the table, locking with each board member's gaze. "If I have to choose, then I'll choose both. I'll rebuild everything from the ground up. I'm not going to let this project, this cause, and my future be held hostage by anyone, not even my own family." The words hit like a bombshell. Lily could feel her heart race in her chest. The room, which had been filled with skepticism and fear, seemed to pause, the air thick with the weight of his declaration. For a moment, there was only silence. No one spoke. No one moved. And then, slowly, one by one, the board members began to exchange glances, a silent acknowledgement of what David had just committed to. Lily watched as the room fell into a stunned quiet. David had made his choice, and it was clear that nothing would sway him. He was willing to sacrifice it all for what mattered to him, his beliefs, his integrity, and, most importantly, the woman sitting across from him. But as David's eyes met hers once more, she couldn't help but wonder if this was truly what he wanted. Was he willing to burn bridges to rebuild something he didn't even fully understand yet? She wanted to believe in him, in them. But the weight of the choice they had just made was immense. She knew they were in this together. But how much further could they go, and would the world ever stop pressing down on them? The project that David and Lily had started together had grown beyond what they ever imagined. What began as an idea to help a few families had blossomed into something bigger, a beacon of hope in a community that had been struggling for far too long. Scholarships were being handed out to students who never thought they'd have a chance at college. Homes that had long been abandoned or dilapidated were now being restored, providing new hope for those who had no place to turn. A small exhibition center stood as a testament to the spirit of the people they had helped, and every inch of it bore the fingerprints of their hard work, their passion, their commitment to making the world a better place, one person at a time. But as they stood there, watching the success of their efforts unfold before them, Lily couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. There was no massive celebration, no grandiose applause, no overwhelming praise. Instead, there was a quiet satisfaction, a calm in the air as the community took notice of the changes, small, incremental, yet profoundly impactful. They hadn't changed the world, but they had changed a part of it. They had changed lives, and in doing so, they had created something beautiful that would last long after the dust settled, standing at the center of the gathering. David and Lily shared a moment of silent pride. The air was thick with the kind of contentment that only comes from hard-earned success. There was no need for speeches or accolades. The success was written all over the faces of the people they had helped, in the laughter of the children who now had access to better education, in the smiles of the families who could sleep in homes that were no longer falling apart. As the crowd began to disperse, David and Lily stood together near the entrance of the exhibition center. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden glow over the scene. People walked past them, smiling, talking, going about their lives. But for a brief moment, it felt like time had stopped. The world seemed to hold its breath. David turned to Lily, his face soft, his expression unreadable for a moment. He seemed as if he was searching for the right words, something that had always been difficult for him in moments like these, moments when emotions ran high, when everything they had worked for was staring them right in the face. But this time, he didn't hesitate. "I don't need the fame," he said, his voice low, but steady. "I don't need the recognition. What matters is that I get to be a part of your world, a part of this world, a part of the world we've built together." His words hit her like a soft wave, gentle but undeniable. "I don't need to be known. I just need to be with you, to know that this is what I was meant to do." Lily's breath caught in her throat. Her heart began to race, but it wasn't the anxious, fearful pounding that had haunted her for so long. This was something different, something new, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in so long, for so long. She had built walls around her heart, protecting herself from the possibility of disappointment, of pain. She had convinced herself that she could never trust again, never believe in anyone fully again, especially not someone like David. But as she looked into his eyes, she realized something. He wasn't just the man who had helped her rebuild a shattered community. He wasn't just the man who had quietly and patiently stood by her through every challenge. He was the man who had proven to her, time and time again, that he was willing to change, to grow, and to be better. And in that moment, Lily knew that the decision wasn't just about the project, the community, or the changes they had made. It was about something much bigger. It was about them. It was about the relationship they had built, about the trust they had slowly forged, about the love that had begun to bloom in the spaces between them. "David," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to prove anything to me. I see you now. I see everything you've done for this community, for us, for me." Her voice wavered, but she steadied herself, looking directly into his eyes. "I don't need anything grand. Just you." And that was it. The moment they had been waiting for, the moment that had seemed impossible, was finally here. There were no more walls between them, no more doubts, no more hesitation. There was just the simple truth that they were both in this together, not as two people from different worlds, but as partners, as equals, as two souls who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and had decided to build something worth fighting for. But just as the warmth of that moment seemed to settle, a voice broke through, piercing the silence. It was one of the people from the crowd, someone who had been watching them from afar. "Are you two together? Is that what this is? What is it really?" Lily looked at David, her heart still fluttering with the weight of what had just transpired. The words were simple, but they carried so much more. They were asking, as if the question could define everything about them, about their future, about the truth that had begun to take root between them. David didn't flinch. He didn't back away. He simply smiled, his eyes never leaving hers. "Yes," he said firmly, and Lily's heart seemed to catch in her throat. "Yes, we are, and this is only the beginning." But even as he said it, Lily couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to come. There would be challenges. There would be questions. The world wouldn't just let them walk away from the things they had built, the decisions they had made. And yet, she knew deep in her bones that they had already crossed a threshold. They had chosen to be together, to trust, to love. And no matter what came next, they would face it side by side. As the last of the crowd trickled out of the center, the sunset casting long shadows across the pavement, Lily and David stood together, their fingers brushing lightly, the world around them quieting. But Lily knew that things had changed. Something had shifted between them, something real, and it was only just beginning. A year had passed since that pivotal moment in their lives, and the world around them had shifted in ways they had never imagined. The city was bustling as it always had been, but today there was something different in the air. It wasn't the usual noise of traffic or the hum of activity. It was something more profound, something that resonated in the hearts of everyone present. It was the day of the grand opening of the Henderson Community Center, a place that stood as a testament to everything Lily and David had fought for. It wasn't just a building. It was a symbol of transformation, of healing, and of hope. Lily stood beside David, her heart filled with a mix of pride and disbelief. She had seen the potential in him from the very start, but even she hadn't fully grasped how much he was willing to change, how much he was willing to sacrifice for the greater good. And now, as she looked around at the community members, the smiling faces of children, the families who now had a place to call their own, she realized how much they had achieved together. David had never been one for public accolades, but today, he stood at the center of it all, his usual reserved demeanor replaced with a quiet confidence. He had worked tirelessly, not for glory or recognition, but because he knew that this was the right thing to do. He had started with a dream, and now that dream was a reality. The community center was thriving, full of life, full of energy, full of promise. As they made their way through the crowd, greeting those who had come to celebrate with them, Lily couldn't help but feel the weight of the past year. It hadn't been easy. There had been countless challenges along the way. The backlash from David's family, the skepticism from their peers, the constant pressure to prove that they were doing the right thing. But through it all, they had stood by each other, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. And now, standing at the threshold of their new life together, Lily felt a sense of calm she had never known before. As she looked at David, she wasn't seeing the wealthy businessman who had once seemed so distant and out of reach. She wasn't seeing the man who had made mistakes, who had been driven by ambition and expectation. No, today, she saw something else. She saw the man who had stood by her through thick and thin, the man who had made himself vulnerable, who had been willing to change not just for her, but for the community they had both come to love. The man who had given up so much of himself to build something real, something that mattered. Her gaze softened as she met his eyes. He smiled at her, and in that moment, everything that had been said and unsaid between them hung in the air like a silent agreement. They had made it. They had overcome the odds, together. And now, there was nothing left to prove. They had found their way through the darkness and into the light, side by side. And that was enough. Lily took a deep breath, her heart steadying in her chest. She didn't need to say anything more. Her smile was all the words she needed. The future was no longer uncertain. They were building it together. The ceremony continued, but Lily's thoughts were interrupted by a small tug at her sleeve. She turned to find a little boy standing there, holding something in his hands. He looked up at her with bright eyes, his face glowing with excitement. "Here," he said, handing her a small, intricately carved figure. It was a small statue, no taller than a hand, and it depicted a woman standing alongside a man, both of them holding hands, facing forward. The resemblance to Lily and David was uncanny, their figures captured in the delicate craftsmanship of the sculpture. She took it from his hands, touched by the gesture. "This is for you," the boy said, beaming. "It's a picture of you and him. You make us believe in good things. And now, you're both part of our story." Lily's heart swelled, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. She was overcome with emotion, the weight of everything they had accomplished crashing down on her all at once. This small figure was more than just a gift. It was a symbol of everything they had built together, of the community they had restored, of the lives they had changed, and of the love that had grown between them in the process. She looked at David, and he looked back at her, his eyes filled with understanding. They didn't need to say anything. The gift spoke for itself. It was a moment of pure, unspoken connection. Their journey had come full circle. As the ceremony drew to a close, the crowd began to disperse, but Lily and David stayed behind, taking in the scene before them. The community center stood tall and proud, its doors wide open, welcoming everyone who needed it. The future stretched out before them, a future they would build together. Lily turned to David one last time, her voice soft but resolute. "We did it. We really did it." He nodded, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "No, we didn't. We didn't do it alone. We did it with everyone." Lily smiled, her heart full. "And that's enough," she said, the words simple, but carrying the weight of everything they had accomplished. And with that, they walked hand in hand into the future, knowing that no matter what came next, they had already built something extraordinary. Not just a building, not just a community, but a life together. A life built on trust, on love, and on the shared understanding that they didn't have to be the same to be together. They only had to look in the same direction. As they stood side by side, watching the community center they built together buzz with life, there was no grand declaration, no applause, just the quiet hum of people coming together, of something simple yet profound taking shape. Maybe that's what it means to make a difference, not by moving mountains, but by picking up the pieces of a broken world, one small act at a time. There are no easy answers, no quick fixes, but sometimes all it takes is the willingness to show up, day after day, and walk beside someone, even when the road ahead is unclear. In the end, maybe that's the real lesson, the courage to stand together, to keep moving forward, despite the weight of the past. The world doesn't change overnight, but in the quiet moments, a new beginning can be found.